time is it? That's a question that gets asked on a regular basis, and many of us who have preached have seen people looking at their watches at times, turning and looking at the clocks, and going through life. We're bound by time. We understand that, trying to get to work on time, trying to get off on time, a lunch break, getting back at a specific time. Time is important. We mark time, important events in our lives with time, birthdays, anniversaries, those types of things are important to us, and we find ourselves focusing on time. But Solomon, in his wisdom in the Ecclesiastes letter, talked about time and how that there's a purpose and there's a time for everything under the sun. And as you look at the Ecclesiastes letter, Solomon in his experiments was trying to find out what was good for man under the sun. And here in this world, on this earth, we're bound by the laws of time. Eternity is awaiting us on the other side. But listen to some of the things as we meditate upon the scriptures this morning that Solomon said about that time and purpose for everything under the sun, and it'll help us maybe to see better and put things in perspective a little bit better in this world in which we live, looking for that time when we will be with God for all eternity. That's what we're hoping for. Listen to what Solomon said. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 3, starting with verse 1. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. Again, there's that under the heaven. And the seasons and the times that we're seeing, we're bound by those in this physical realm, as he was, and there was a purpose for those things, as we'll see as he continues. A time to be born, verse 2, and a time to die. A time to be born, we had nothing to do with that. We couldn't set the time and the parameters for our birth. We were born, and you're listening to this, and I'm sitting here reading this. That time, we met that time. We were born. But there's a time to die as well. It's appointed unto men once to die, Hebrews 9:27. We're all going that way. As a matter of fact, you continue in the Ecclesiastes letter, and you go over to chapter 12, in verse 7, he says, then shall the body return to the dust as it was. This physical body is going to return to the dust as it was, but the spirit's going to return to God who gave it. So there's a time to be born, and there's a time to die. There's a time to pluck or plant, and there's a time to pluck that which is planted. A good farmer knows the seasons. He knows when's the best time to plant his seed, but he also needs to know when's the right time to harvest that crop as well. Again, these things in our physical world are bound by the timetable. Time to kill, verse 3, and a time to heal. We're not talking about murder in this. Clearly, Solomon would write the Proverbs letter as well, and he said, these 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination to him. And one of those are hands that shed innocent blood. God hates that, so we're not talking about murder. But if you go over to Romans chapter 13, you know that the governments are ordained of God, and they don't bear the sword in vain. The sword is a sword, an instrument of death, a corporal punishment of putting those malefactors to their end results in the death of those who would do evil and who would do wrong. But he also said there's a time to heal. And that reminds me of Luke chapter 10, verses 29 following, where we're told, Jesus tells a story of that Samaritan man who helps out this fellow who was taken by thieves. He pours oil into his wounds and binds him up and takes him to an inn and cares for that man. We refer to him often as the Good Samaritan. But he did that which was profitable. And he asked who was the neighbor to this man, either the Levite or the priest. He says, no, it was the one who did good, the one who helped. And so we're to do likewise. A time to heal when we see those that have need. He says a time to break down and a time to build up. A time to break down reminds me of 2 Chronicles chapter 34. 2 Chronicles chapter 34, as you look at Josiah, 8 years old, he becomes king. Verse 3, it says, and in the 8th year of his reign, while he was yet young, he began to seek after God, the God of David, his father. And in the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem from the high places and the groves and the carved images and the molten images. Those idol-worshiping artifacts and places that had been established in among God's people. He starts to change these things. This is not right. Verse 4 says, and they break down the altars of Balaam. in his presence, and in the images that were on high above them, he cut down, and the groves and the carved images and the molten images he brake in pieces, and made dust of them, and strode it upon the graves of them that sacrificed unto them. He cleansed the temple. He purged over and over again those words, but breaking down. What did he say again back in Ecclesiastes chapter 3? A time to break down and a time to build up. So he broke down that idol worship and he built back up the worship to Jehovah God. We need to do the same thing today as well in our lives. Break down the sin that's in our lives and build up the spiritual life that we need to be having as well. Verse 4, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Those two phrases are fitting together in this same verse, and it's interesting when you think about the attitude that we're to have as Christians. It reminds me of Romans chapter 12, verse 15. We're to rejoice with them that do rejoice and weep with them that do weep. Finding those opportunities to be of the same mind, to help one another, to encourage one another. He said again, a time to weep at the death of a loved one, at the death of a loved one's friend, the loved one of someone else has passed away, and you can be there to weep with them. Even if you don't know them, it's easy to mourn with those, but also to rejoice with those that do rejoice when they have something good happening in their lives. A child is born into this world. We've had it at our family here at East Main. We've had new children born into this world, and what a blessing it is to see those families growing, and we rejoice with them. A raise, a promotion at work, those things, rejoice with those who rejoice. But he also says that there's a time to mourn and a time to dance. Mourning is in that time of loss, as we talked about earlier, but also a time to dance is to skip, to leap, it shows excitement and exuberance. That's what we're supposed to be doing, and that's what he says. There's a time for that. Now, we wouldn't be skipping and jumping and leaping at the death of a loved one. No, we would mourn at that time. So again, the times of these things. Be wise about this. He says in verse 5, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Maybe a concept there is that of the farmer again, where he goes out to prepare his field and gets the stones out of the way, the rocks that are in the ground. You want to remove those so you'll have fertile ground, and so it wouldn't affect the plant, the tender plant that you're going to be growing there. But there's also a time to gather up stones, maybe to build a house, to build a gateway, to build a fence, a wall. Time to use those stones. Again, that's common sense. A time to embrace, he says there in verse 5, and a time to refrain from embracing. Those of us who are huggers in this time of quarantine and pandemic, we miss that time of embracing, and we long for that time of embracing again. We miss that, but there's a time for it. And there's a time to let go, a time to hold on, and a time to turn loose. Those types of things that he's talking about. He goes on to verse 6, a time to get, some translations have, or seek, and a time to lose. There's a time when we need to be seeking. We need to seek the Lord when he can be found. We need to be looking for him, longing for him, seeking his ways, seeking the truth. Remember, Jesus said, Matthew 7, ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be open unto you. But there are other things that we ought not seek. We ought not seek the ways of evil. We ought not look to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. We're to avoid those things, to loose those things from our lives. A time to keep and a time to cast away. Buy the truth and sell it not, but turn loose of those sinful ways. Get rid of those things. Think about the idea, a time of business. There's a time when you buy and there's a time when you sell. There's a time when you need to hold on to those investments and a time when you need to turn loose of those investments. Verse number 7, a time to rend and a time to sow. In the customs of the Jews back in the day, when a hardship or distress would befall them, often we would read of them tearing their clothes. They would rend their clothes. And that's that time of sorrow and sadness. But then there will be a time of sewing those back together again. Others have said maybe it's an idea of if you have a garment, an older garment, and you wanted to pass that down to a younger person, you have to disassemble that garment and then sew it back together to where it would fit the younger generation. Those concepts play into this, a time to rend and a time to sow. But this next phrase, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. That reminds me of Luke 23. Jesus brought before Herod wouldn't even say a word, wouldn't open his mouth. There's a time when we ought to speak. There's a time when we need to say things. There's a time when we need to keep silent. I think about Job's friends. When Job's friends come to him in his distress, there's a week that they spend of saying nothing, and they were true friends at that point. But then when they opened their mouths, they began to speak. The things that they said were not true. The things that they said were hurtful and not helpful. We need to think before we speak. Is it true? Is it honest? Is it important? Is it necessary? And is it kind? Think before we speak, because there's a time to speak and there's a time to keep silent. Verse 8 says, a time to love and a time to hate. Love is the greatest of these. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is, abides faith, hope, love. The greatest of these is love. This concept of hate is one that we often miss, though. It's not that we're to hate anyone. Jesus would say, love your enemies. But according to Psalm 119, 104, also Psalm 119, 128, we're to hate every evil way. There's nothing wrong with hating every evil way. And we also read in Luke chapter 14, 26, the concept of loving anything more than God makes us not worthy of God. We can't love father or mother. If a man comes to me and hates not his father or mother, we know that to be, and you've heard it said by many preachers, no doubt, love less. Love less. Matthew 10 makes that clear. If any man loves father or mother more than me, he's not worthy of me. And so there's that concept more so in what he's talking about in this time of hate. We know that God hates certain things. We go back to Proverbs 6. These 6 things that the Lord hates, yea, 7 are abomination to him, including hands that shed innocent blood. He says a time of war and a time of peace. There's a time for war and there's a time for peace. There's a time for taking action against the evil that's in this world. And that's what he's talking about. But also, we are to be peacemakers according to the Beatitudes that we read in Matthew chapter 5 in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. That's who we are to be as well. And there's times for these things. Then he says, finally in verse 9, what profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboreth? All of these things and these times that he's talking about, these times are reminders that we're living in a physical world. But when it comes to the end, this is a rhetorical question that he makes in verse 9. Similar question to what Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 16, verse 26. What is a man profited if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? In the end, he goes on to say later on in the chapter, the purpose in our lives, what we're here to do is to do good, to rejoice in this life, to take advantage of the blessings that God has given us in this life, to do good. Verse 12, I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life. Verse 17, because God's going to judge the righteous and the wicked. There's a time for that. It's appointed unto men once to die. And after this, the judgment. So what time is it for you? What time is it for me? It's time to make sure that we're doing good in this life. It's time to make sure that we're living for that next life. It's time that we make sure today is the day of salvation. And we're ready to be with the Lord. We're ready to be with Him for all eternity. That's something on which we can meditate. That's a time on which we can meditate this Monday and every day. May God bless you till we meet again.